Hello, John. How you doing?
Good evening, Tyler. How are you?
I am doing awesome. As
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 am
you can
I.
as you can tell, it's just you and I today. No distractions. No um, no worries about what's going on in the real world. We're just ready to dive right in deep into this Mormon history.
Yeah, it's uh, it's a pleasurable thing to be here with just you and I, all alone together, the two of us, secluded. It's a nice feeling.
It's great. We always had the others just tagging along, trying to keep up with us too in the good old days. So finally we get you and me time. Perfect.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, for those of you who haven't noticed yet, this is, well, it's not being streamed like we have for all the other podcasts. We're trying something different. We're going to stream these and then just release them and kind of see where that takes us. So, kind of excited to change up the pace and see how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be fun.
No more talking about the big games or basketball scores because those would have happened in the past. And no one will be interested in who won the basketball game a week and a half ago.
Yeah, they'll be like, "What basketball game?" As they listen, 6 months from now or
Yeah.
whatever. But
Well, great. Well, I guess that means we can jump right into it.
yes, yes. So we're going to continue with our discussion on Mormonism and magic, as we'll call it. Uh, so the last few weeks we've been talking about how magic fit into the American worldview at the time of Joseph Smith, and how really it was quite normal, right? And that this idea of magic built off of centuries of magic traditions. And we've talked about the different kinds of magic, how people would have perceived it. And now today we're going to be talking about how it applied directly to Mormon history. So we've done the context, and now we'll do, the actual history of it.
Cool.
But before we jump into that, one of the fun things that I've enjoyed about this podcast is the interaction with our listeners. And just in the last few weeks, we've been getting some questions from our
Awesome.
wonderful, wonderful listeners. So I thought I would begin by addressing some of those. So
Do you
this is
want
a
me?
question. Oh,
Do you
yeah,
want
if you
me to
want to read
read
it,
the question? Okay.
sure. Go
Um,
ahead.
Question number one from I don't know who this is from, so I will just read it.
Listen.
Did people from
Yeah,
listener
go ahead.
A in exhibit 321? Did people prior to the time did people prior to their time really bury treasure like gold and jewels, like the stuff Nicolas Cage would have found? If so, why would they go all the way to upstate New York to bury such treasure?
Great question. There's a few things we need to address first, though. Number one, Nicolas Cage, I don't think was a very successful treasure digger or seeker. I mean, he followed treasure, not treasure maps even, but like clues and things. I would have gone with Indiana Jones, uh, the greatest treasure hunter of all time, but that's just my opinion. So, if treasure was ever found in upstate New York, it was usually by accident and usually in the form of a mine or some sort of strange artifact that they couldn't really explain. So then the question is, if they weren't really that successful in finding buried treasure, then why keep doing it? And because that's the context of all this, or the implication of all this. If they're obviously digging for treasure for some reason, and Tyler, I'm sure if you were to hear about something not being successful over and over and over again, you probably wouldn't do it, right?
Are you asking if me, Tyler, or if a typical person? So
I
I get caught into insane
It's just a
things.
hypothetical, Tyler. You don't
Hypothetically,
need to
if I knew,
overthink it.
yes, if I try something over and over and over, um, my gut tells me that I would probably give up eventually.
Right.
I feel like this might be a leading question, but that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, that's a fine answer. Yeah. So think about the lottery, right? What are your chances of winning the lottery? I don't know, 1 in 100 million, something like that.
I suppose it depends on which lottery ticket you're buying.
Okay, but yeah, we don't need to overthink it, Tyler.
Yes, I'd say one in over 100 million. It's
Okay.
because you can win billions of dollars. I'm sure it's like
Hmm.
one in several billion chances.
Yeah. Yeah. So your chances are very, very remote, and yet people buy lottery tickets all the time, daily. You know, millions of dollars are spent on lottery tickets. And I would argue there's something similar here, but to another, taking it to another level of fascination, right? You buy a lottery ticket, you bought it, you have it, you don't win, it's done. But with treasure seeking, there's a lot more to it. You know, there's a religious component to it, there's a spiritual component to it, there's a sense of excitement around it. You know, everybody likes ghost stories, and all of these treasure hunting histories have a ghost story element to them. So,
John,
uh-huh.
by religious component, can I just pick on that a little bit? Are you saying these people feel like they're called of God to be treasure diggers, or do you think they're just trying to use God's influence, and if they ask, then God will bless them with this treasure?
Yeah, both. It depends on the
Okay.
person, right, and the experience. But yeah, absolutely, treasure hunting to a lot of people in the early 1800s, it was a religious experience for them. Now, obviously, for most of them, the primary reason to do it is to get rich quick. But also, when they are engaging in this experience, they are bringing in supernatural components, spirits. They're hearkening back to the Old and New Testament with conjuring up these items that have these spiritual elements to them. Uh, but we'll get into that. Before we dive too deep into that, I do want to give a little bit more context around why people thought there would have been so much treasure in the New England and New York area. And it goes back to when uh, European settlers first come to the New World. Imagine discovering this new land. There's nothing there, right? But there is a history. So imagine you're an English Puritan. You come to the New World. You know that the Spanish explorers have been to the New World. And what did the Spanish do when they got here? They found treasure, right? They found the Aztecs and the Mayans, not the Mayans, but the Aztecs and the Inca civilizations, right? And these civilizations were filthy rich as far as the Spaniards were concerned because they had tons of gold and silver. And the English knew this, right? They knew that the Spanish explorers had found all these things. They also, but what they didn't know is that how far that Spanish exploration had gone, right? They knew that there had been explorers, conquistadors who had come to the New World, found treasure. For the most part, they brought it home, but maybe they also buried it somewhere. So you have this brand new land, untouched. It's full of mystery. But what they do know about it is that there used to be ancient civilizations like the Inca and the Aztecs, who were filthy rich, and they knew that the Spanish explorers and the Portuguese explorers, to some extent, had experienced this wealth and had done something with it. So that's the context that they are coming into as they reach the New World.
And was all that gold? I mean, when I think of, you mentioned the Aztecs, the Incas, they're down more Central America. Is
Right.
that where primarily all these treasures or precious metals were, dare I say, stolen or taken, or was it all down there, or did they also were natives up north also um, have a lot of this abundant precious metal?
Yeah, great question. So that's what the English settlers and colonizers would have wondered themselves. Like the Spanish knew about these ancient or found just randomly found these old civilizations, not old at the time, but I guess 100 years or so, a couple hundred years.
Oh, so when I
They
say stolen, they were abandoned by that point.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Aztec and Inca civilizations were pretty much
Long
under
gone. Okay.
Spanish control by now. Yeah, I mean they weren't gone, right? It's like indigenous
Well,
Native Americans here. There's still
maybe
elements, but they had
yeah.
been conquered. Yeah.
Maybe I'm asking. I used the word stole. Is that an appropriate term, or
I
was
would,
all these things
yeah.
buried and forgotten about?
No, I would say stolen is a
Okay.
accurate term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So
Fair
the
enough.
Spanish come in, they steal the wealth of the Inca and the Aztecs, and so these English settlers and Dutch settlers come to North America, and they think maybe there was a civilization like the Inca or the Aztecs here too. And you think about your old North American history, Tyler, where there were these mounds that indigenous populations had built, right? These giant burial mounds, and some of these uh, people would come. Some of these European settlers come to North America and they see these mounds. They dig into them and they find, graves, things like that.
So I will say,
Yeah.
John, I hadn't really either. I hadn't learned about the mounds, or I had not remembered learning about the mounds until I got back into a little bit of digging as it relates to um, kind of the treasure digging around this time period. So, could you talk a little bit about those mounds and kind of what they are, who put them there, and what the scholarly world thinks of them?
Sure. So I don't know a whole lot about them. It's more of a archaeological field. But yeah, so you had these ancient Native American indigenous peoples who built these giant civilizations. The biggest one I think is called Cahokia, and it was in Illinois, I want to say. But archaeologists have dug up these massive cities that were built mostly out of uh, man-made hills and mounds. So they would create these mounds, right, by just piling dirt on top of dirt, and then the grass grows over it, and then you can build like these wooden structures on top of these mounds, things like that. And some of these cities were pretty big. They could hold, I want to say, over 1,000 people in them, which is
Wow.
pretty big for that time.
Do you know
Um,
how big the mounds were?
yeah, so the mounds could be really, really large. In fact, if you want to let me share my screen, I can show you the remains of one.
Well, while you
Let me
pull
do
that
that.
up, maybe we can talk.
Yeah.
I'm sure they've been dated. What date range did the archaeologists say these were built?
Um.
You mean it's if you don't know, I know this isn't.
Yeah. So it would have been, I want to say, from like the 500 BC to 1,000 BC, or not. I'm sorry, not BC, CE. So like 500 CE to 1,000 CE.
Okay.
So here, let me show you
So
this one.
pre any um, European influence.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So can you see this? This is
I
Monk's Mound in Cahokia.
yeah.
You can see, I mean, this is a hill that unfortunately it's got this power line in the middle of it, but this is a hill that was built by indigenous peoples of North America. Now, the Inca, the Maya, the Aztecs, they get a lot of attention, and rightfully so, for all the temples and structures they built down in Central and South America. But what a lot of people don't realize is that something similar was going on in North America, not to quite the degree that it was in Central America, but to some degree, right? There, you do
Okay.
have these huge mounds. I mean, this
I'm
isn't natural. This is something that some indigenous people put together.
I'm gonna do my best to explain this in words. Oh, and it's disappeared, so that's fine. So that looked like it had what, 200 steps ish to get to the top. I'm sure the
Mhm.
steps were put in later, but so 200 steps, is that somewhere around 15 stories? So maybe 150 to 200 feet tall ish. And the size of it
Yeah,
looks like it really, to me, it looked like a almost an abandoned landfill where they take the landfill and they put grass and a park over it. The size of it was pretty impressive. As far as acreage, I mean,
yeah. So I
multiple, maybe the size of a college football, medium-sized college football stadium size wise is
mhm.
kind of my guess, just looking at it. But,
Yeah, let me pull up the sizes here, the stats. Okay, so in 1988, Monk's Mound, which is the largest of these earthworks, was 100 feet high, 955 feet long, and 775 feet wide, which is roughly the same size at its base as the Great Pyramid of Giza. So
okay,
probably not as high, but around the base, it's just as large.
all right.
Um,
So we've established what these are. They're for something built 500 CE. That's massive compared to anything else we have from these indigenous Americans. So why is this important, John? I forget.
yeah,
I
so
forget. I pulled you into this again.
yeah. So you have European settlers coming to North America and they see these mounds and so they're immediately intrigued by them. I mean, Monk's Mound isn't the only one. You could see these mounds from I know they're pretty prevalent in the South up to the Midwest, Illinois, Ohio area and then into I want to say New York, upstate New York. So they would have seen these and they would have thought oh, these are not natural. Somebody built these, so there must have been some uh, impressive ancient civilization that built these. And so you tie that back into treasure digging, and you think, okay, maybe these giant or these ancient civilizations that built these giant earthworks, they must have been rich. They must have left treasure behind. So you have that mixed with Spanish explorers who did find treasure, and you have kind of a recipe for an open mindedness to finding ancient or not so ancient treasure buried in this vast wilderness that hasn't been developed.
Do
You
you
follow me
know if
so
there were?
far?
Yeah, yeah. This is great. Do you know if there were also ties of people believing that the indigenous people, as they interpret them, would not be capable of doing this? So it must have been built by different culture, different. Well, I don't know if culture is the right term, but a different race of people.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know more about uh, sort of the European view of this, um, but there is sort of a and we've talked about race before, right? How it didn't necessarily exist as a concept until around the time of Joseph Smith. That's when Europeans, especially, start to kind of figure out okay, there's different groups of people. Let's categorize them and let's rank them based on how we perceive them. So obviously the white race would have been on top, and I think you're absolutely right. There would have been uh, some thought or belief that a superior race, probably one that resembled the European race more closely, um, meaning being whiter, would have been responsible for these types of structures. I know that there was a thought of that in when Europeans discovered Africa. You know, they see all these really impressive uh, structures and things. They think, oh, well, black Africans couldn't have made this. There must have been white Africans doing it. Like, I know the Queen of Sheba, who's mentioned in the Old Testament, there there was a long held belief that she was white because she was so rich, right? She couldn't be that rich and not be white, you know. So there is that kind of thought. There's also a nationalistic component to it where again, you have these settlers, they're coming to America, and if we go to Joseph Smith's time, the United States is a brand new country. They just won their independence 40, 50 years ago. So there's sort of this desire to cultivate a nationalistic pride in the place that they live. And there was this idea, it was just sort of starting to snowball at the time, that Americans were a chosen people who had arrived to a chosen land, and this land was sort of set apart for them because it was a sacred land. And so they come, these Europeans and now Americans, they're trying to establish a national identity based around a history that they're still trying to figure out. Do you follow me so far?
Yeah. And so I guess a follow-up question then. This is making sense to me as I put it in church context, where Lehi and Nephi's family, as far as I understand, are a white race when they get to America, and that they were the Lamanites were very productive, industrious, built large civilizations. So this makes perfect sense in that context. Are you telling me that this same, when you say they, are you talking pre-restoration within the um, society in New York area? That was kind of the how they saw the Native Americans as well.
So I think when I say they, I mean Americans at in the 1800s. They would have
Okay.
wanted to establish themselves as a chosen country or a chosen society. And to do that, you have to have a sacred beginning or a sacred past, or at least a superior past, right? So they could have come. They're spreading through North America, this vast untapped wilderness that only indigenous people have been in before, and they see these massive mounds, and they think, yes, there was once a great civilization that lived here. And by saying that, that institutes um, an identity of superiority, because it's like, look, we came to this land that was once dominated by this a huge and wealthy society, and now we hold this land. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
So yeah, so they're trying to establish this nationalistic identity by saying these wealthy civilizations once lived here, just like they once lived in Central and South America. Of course, that's not quite the truth, right? The people who built Cahokia, absolutely big, massive, wealthy society, but in a different way than the Inca and the Aztecs would have been. Uh, so anyway, so you mix that with um, Spanish explorations who were famous for finding gold and silver mines in Central and South America, and you have that same desire with Americans, first European settlers in North America, and then Americans who want that same tradition, who want that same fame that the Spanish had. And then you mix that on top of that with the religious component that we've already talked about, that comes with magic, right? So you're mixing all these things together, and the result is a culture that is open to treasure seeking through spiritual and supernatural means. You follow me so far? You have this blank stare. I'm pretty sure that's your normal look, but I never know with you, Tyler.
I'm good. I'm loving this.
Okay,
That was my
so
that was my podcast face.
very good. Okay, so anyway, that's kind of a long answer to that, but I hope our listener found it helpful. The other thing that I want to talk about in terms of this question is pirates. So, pirates, of course, are famous for burying treasure. And there were all kinds of pirate stories around the North Atlantic or the Atlantic coast, the Western Atlantic coast, of pirates like Blackbeard, who sailed up and down North America. There was one famous pirate named William Kidd, who's called Captain Kidd by his fans. He was an Englishman who became a pirate in the Indian Ocean and became famous for pillaging a bunch of ships. And because he was a pirate, obviously the British Navy put out a warrant on him, a hit on him. And he actually, I want to say he turned himself in Boston, or he was at least caught there. So now you have this exotic story of this very successful and famous pirate who starts off in the Indian Ocean and then winds up in North America, gets caught, then he's taken to London where he's executed. So there were all kinds of stories around this Captain Kidd, that because he had come to North America because he knew that the British were onto him, they were chasing him, and that he would have a place to bury his treasure. And so there's tons of stories around North America, the northern areas of America at this time, of Captain Kidd's treasure. So that plays into it too, just the folklore of it all. There's and back to the Spanish too. This is kind of a fun story. There were actually lots of different stories around New England of these Spanish men just showing up out of nowhere. So, for example, there's one story of a Spaniard who'd show up in Vermont in 1800 and just started digging around the town. And finally, people like make contact with him and they ask him what he's doing. And he finally tells them that he had belonged to a group of Spanish explorers who had taken their treasure and buried it in this area, Vermont, and left it there. And he was the sole survivor of this group, and he had come back to claim his treasure. And the funny thing is, this same story pops up all over these different towns in New England and New York. So there's a folklore element to it. You have the nationalistic component, the religious component, and then the folklore just kind of makes it all that much more fun.
Cool.
So then to summarize it all together, Tyler, you have mostly rumors of people finding treasure, but those rumors are built on the possibility of finding treasure based on these three different components. So,
and obviously those mounds were not were built by the indigenous natives of the land, and they weren't treasure mounds, but you said at the beginning that they were just mass grave cemeteries.
Yeah, some of them were tombs. The Monk's Mound at Cahokia was just sort of a structural mound that they could build buildings on top of.
Did you mention, do some of them have rooms inside, or are they all just?
Yeah, I think for the most part they were just built for structural purposes. Just to sort of build these man-made mountains. But I do want to say that a lot of them did have chambers in them as well. But they're just graves. I don't think any great wealth came out of discovering any of them.
it wasn't like the Egyptians where they felt they had to put all the wealth in with the deceased.
Well, that's a good question too, because wealth to one person in Cahokia would have meant something very different to an Egyptian pharaoh,
Oh,
right?
gotcha. Good point.
Yeah, so someone who gets buried in Cahokia, if they're buried with a goat and maybe some beads, that's great wealth for them.
Yeah,
And I'm not saying that I don't know enough about it to say that that was considered wealthy in Cahokia. I'm just assuming.
but
So it's
it wasn't gold and precious metals that could be pillaged. At least.
exactly, yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Well, that was a
So
great question. I'm
yeah,
glad we talked about that.
yeah. So there was another question from him. Do you see that there?
Yeah, I do. So, did Joseph Smith ever find treasure besides the plates? I assume the golden plates is what he's referring to.
Yes, I assume that too. Not really what we would consider treasure, but he did. So he supposedly found a lot of random stuff, like a cannonball and some gold watches. These are just stories from his neighbors. In the court case that we've talked about in the past, where he was charged for being a disorderly person, um, there were testimonials that said he used his seer stone to find lost property. So there's that. And then in 1859, Martin Harris told a kind of, I think it's kind of disgusting, but he told the story about Joseph finding a pin in a pile of shavings. So I'm sure you're asking, why is this gross? What's a pin? And what are shavings?
Do
So
you
I'll
want me to
just
read
read.
that? Do you
Sure,
want me
go
to
ahead.
read, or I'll give
Yeah, go ahead.
your voice box a little break? Should I clear my throat? This is my
Louder.
Martin Harris. This is my Martin Harris voice.
Okay.
I was at the house of his father in Manchester, 2 miles south of Palmyra village, and was picking my teeth with a pin while sitting on the bars. The pin caught in my teeth and dropped from my fingers into shavings and straw. I jumped from the bars and looked for it. Joseph and Northrop Sweet also did the same. We could not find it. I then took Joseph on surprise and said to him, I said, take your stone. I had never seen it and did not know that he had it with him. He had it in his pocket. He took it and placed it in his hat, the old white hat, and placed his face in his hat. I watched him closely to see that he did not look to one side. He reached out his hand beyond me on the right and moved a little stick, and there I saw the pin, which he picked up and gave to me. I know he did not look out of the hat until after he had picked up the pin.
Whoa. He found this for some reason. He thought it was important enough to use his stone to find a pin that Martin Harris was using as a toothpick. So I don't know about you, Tyler, but if someone loses their toothpick, I'm not whipping out my seer stone to find it. That's just me. But
And
anyway,
it sounds not well. I don't know. Not only that, but it was important enough that Martin Harris wrote it down. So
yeah,
definitely left an impression. It wasn't. It wasn't nothing. So
yeah, that must have been some pin. But
what
anyway,
are
yeah,
shavings?
I'm guessing that it was they were in some sort of barn or mill that had been used for building things. Maybe like I'm in my mind, the shavings are like either wood shavings or um, something from wheat. You know, like as they don't they shave the wheat off to kind of be able to. I don't know
I'm not. I'm not an agriculture
to
person.
grind it or something. Yeah.
Okay, so something
So
like that. But all right,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a farmer from the 1800s either, but that's kind of what I think because it says shavings and straw, so I'm assuming it was something like cut up grass or cut up hay, something like that.
Okay.
But anyway, that's kind of a fun story of Joseph using his seer stone to find something. But more than that, though, more than him actually finding things, was that he had the reputation of finding things. Uh, and I think I want to say that a lot of that reputation came from first the knowledge that people had that he had a seer stone, and second that he claimed to have found these gold plates. Josiah Stowell is one, or Stowell is one example of that. This guy who mostly went off of Joseph's reputation, though and we've talked about this before, but he had that experience of when Joseph was able to describe Josiah's property to him in detail. Um, but anyway, so there's that. I think that answers that question pretty well.
So I just want to make sure he never, when you say he never found treasure, I think we talked a little bit last week. He never was able to obtain treasure. I believe there are stories where he found the treasure, but either he was the only one who could see it, or it was either taken or put deeper in the earth. So when you say he hasn't found treasure, I think what we're saying is he never obtained the treasure. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a good clarification.
Okay. All right. Yeah, great. The next question. I read or heard that Joseph Smith actually referred to initially to the spirit as Nephi. Is this spirit the angel Moroni in his first visit?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So I read or heard that Joseph Smith actually referred initially to the spirit as Nephi, but the name was later changed to Moroni by church leadership for consistency's sake.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question because it's sort of puzzled church historians for decades. But there's not really a chronological sense to it. A couple of historians have tried to make sense of why that happened. So anyway, we'll take it chronologically. So Joseph first uses the name Moroni to describe the angel in 1832. And we'll back up a little bit. So in 1823, Angel Moroni, as we now call him, appears to Joseph. And then, so he has that experience. And then for some reason, and then we'll jump ahead to 1832, where Joseph describes the angel as Moroni. And then in 1839, a copy of Joseph's history refers to the angel as Nephi. And that same manuscript was printed twice in a Mormon paper called the Times and Seasons.
Okay, can I just repeat that again then, just to make sure I'm following?
Yep.
So around when did we say 1827 was when he first had the vision, or was it 25?
1823 is when he first sees Moroni. Okay. Yeah.
So 23, and at that point he told people and talked about it, and he referred to it as an angel. And then, as you said here, 1832 is when he first named the angel Moroni, and then 1839 is when they found the copy of his history, or was that when his history was written down?
So that's when it's written down, and we do need to make a clarification. You're right, but 1832 is when the name Moroni is first written down. So yeah. So I think there are some instances that talk about Joseph referring to the angel as Moroni, but they're not written down until after 1832. So it's very possible that Joseph did call the angel Moroni before 1832. 1832 is just when it's first written down.
Gotcha. And then in 1839, somebody wrote down Joseph Smith history and used the name Nephi, referring to the angel.
Exactly. And the reason why it's interesting and kind of confusing is because it was published in 1842, and then again in 1851. So, so theoretically, Joseph would have seen this in 1839 first. He would have seen Moroni being referred to as Nephi, and then he would have seen it again in 1842. He dies in 1844, so the 1851 instance is kind of out the window. But so the question then becomes, theoretically, Joseph saw this. Why didn't he make the correction? Now, most historians consider it just to be a clerical error. Joseph probably just missed it. Richard Bushman calls it a, quote, puzzling mistake. So Joseph could have changed it, but he never did for some reason. And at the same time, church members, including Joseph, keep referring to the angel as Moroni. But then you have another sort of confusing instance where David Whitmer's mother, she claimed to have been a witness of the plates. She claims she saw the plates and that Nephi was the one that showed them to her. So there's a couple explanations. One is that it really was a clerical error and Joseph just never thought to correct it, or maybe he didn't even know. The second is that it was intentional, because the name Nephi is a take, or at its root has a biblical meaning of spirit, and it's also associated with necromancy. So it's possible that he referred to the angel as Nephi, not so much as a specific person, but as a title. That's what a few scholars have done that.
Is there any other place where he would have used the term Nephi referring to just an angel rather than son of Lehi? Or would this be the only instance that we know of?
This is the only one that I know of, but I'm pretty sure there are other examples of people using the term Nephi, or at least something similar to it, to describe a spirit.
Okay.
So it's possible he just used it as a title. So anyway, there's that. It is kind of one of the more puzzling things about church history.
These are great questions.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to ask you after if I know the person who asked them, because I'm sure what they want is to be known by all for these questions. But no, I don't know.
Yeah,
they are great questions, and I'm enjoying this discussion. So thank you for asking, and hopefully we get many more, because this is super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Are we ready for? There's one more question. Are we ready to jump into that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. What do you know about the retrieval of the plates? You mentioned the toad, and I've heard that. I also think I heard he said several things, namely that the spirit instructed him to come back in a year with Alvin, who then died.
Yeah.
So what more can you tell us about retrieving the plates? And this might be the segue into what we were planning on talking about today.
Yep. So this was the perfect question, because just like you said, it leads into our topic. So one of the fun things about church history, I think, is that there's so many different sources that tell the same story, but in different ways, right? So we all know the story. I would think most of our listeners know the story of how Joseph got the plates. I mean, the common narrative is that Moroni appeared to him in 1823, and Joseph went to and showed Joseph the spot where the plates were buried. Joseph went back 4 times each year to receive instruction, and then on the 4th year, he was able to finally take the plates. So that's the basic story, right? But within that story, there's all these different add-ons or subtractions that come from it.
Can I tell you one of my favorite sayings that is not strictly related to this, but I still love it, so I'm going to say it for posterity's sake?
This better be worth it.
It's one of my favorites, so it'll be worth it for me, if for nobody else. It's that if you have one watch, then you always know what time it is. But if you have 2 watches, then you don't know which one's right, and so you then have no idea what time it is anymore, because they're never the exact same, and so if you have one person telling the story, you know the story perfectly. Once you get different people telling the story, you don't know what to believe anymore.
That was surprisingly good, Tyler. Way to go. I'm proud of you.
I'm out of here, everybody. Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Let's just stop now. Pull
No,
a George.
yeah. End on a high note. Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's all these different elements, different people telling the same story. They're adding different things, subtracting different things. So that's what makes this whole section, I think, from just Joseph's early life to 1830, so very interesting. And there are other sections too that we'll get into, weeks down the road. But for now, we'll focus on this one. So we'll start in September of 1823. This is when Joseph finds the plates for the first time. And the traditional narrative is that Moroni shows him the location. He goes there, he finds the plates. Moroni tells him he cannot take them yet because he's not ready, and that he needs to come back in a year. Okay. That's the basic story. So what we'll do now is we'll add things to that story of what other people heard at the time. So one of the more famous tellings of the story comes from Joseph Knight Sr., who was a very good friend of Joseph. Really helped Joseph start with get the church started and the Book of Mormon published and all that sort of thing. And we'll just refer him for clarity's sake. We'll refer to him as Knight because there's too many Josephs in this history. So Knight Sr. wrote that Joseph took the plates, but hesitated. So this is, again, September 1823. This is the first time Joseph sees them. He gets there. He takes the plates,
Is that when Knight wrote this as well?
Oh,
Contemporarily?
okay. Yeah, so that's another good question. So it's sort of a mystery around when this was written, because the writing that it was done on does not have a date. We know that it was written in ink, and that there's actually pages missing from it. So a historian in the 70s found these pages in the church archives and he put them all together, but he's not sure when they were actually written. So but this historian, his last name's Jesse. I want to say starts with a D. Anyway, this historian, last name Jesse, puts these together, and he hypothesized that it was written sometime between 1833 and 1847, which is not very helpful, especially since Knight Sr. died in 1847. So that's a pretty safe assumption, right? He wrote it before he died. So.
And you said 33 or 23?
33.
So that's at least 10 years later.
Right. Yep.
So at least 10 years later, but up to the end of it. Okay.
Yeah. And just a side note, if it's actually pretty hard to find anything related to Mormon history written, I mean, depending on how you define it, but written before 1830, Joseph's just not writing a lot of stuff down before then. A lot of it's hearsay and secondhand stuff. But anyway.
Okay.
So Knight Sr. writes that Joseph gets the plates, he picks them up, but he hesitates because he wanted to see what else was in the box. And once he turns around, the plates disappeared from his hands, and he looks down and they're back inside the box. And so he goes to pick them up again, said he couldn't move them. He asked why, and the angel told him that he didn't obey, because the angel told him, take the plates and go. But Joseph, he hesitated, and so he lost his privilege to actually take them. And the angel said, you have to come back in 1 year with the right person. Bring the right person with you. And Joseph says, what do you mean? Who's the right person? And the angel says, the right person is your brother Alvin. So again, this is coming from Knight Sr. Now the problem with this is September 1823. Alvin dies in November 1823. Now, a little bit about Alvin. Alvin Smith was Joseph's oldest brother. He was the firstborn of Joseph and Lucy, and he was kind of running the family at this point. A lot of historians think that Joseph Sr. was, I would say, according to them, he's kind of suffering from depression at this point. He's in his 50s. He doesn't own any property. He's bounced from one business to the other without ever having much success. He's failed in a lot of different business areas, and now he's old. So Alvin has kind of taken over the family. He's co-signing on things with Joseph Sr. and he's running the farm. He's building all of their homes and things. So he's running the family, and according to Lucy, he was the most interested in Joseph's story about the plates. But then he becomes sick with something called biliary colic or biliary colic. I don't know what it is, but something about gallstones. And they start messing with your insides. I'm not that kind of doctor. But and apparently neither was the person who treated him, because it got worse.
It was it was a different kind of medicine back then.
Yeah. Anyway, Alvin dies. But before he dies, he tells Joseph to do everything he could to get the plates. And
okay.
So this. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to go one step further on this one. Is there any evidence that Joseph would have tried to bring either Alvin's corpse or part of Alvin's body when he did return to the Hill Cumorah?
Yeah, so there was a rumor around that that Alvin had been dug up and taken, and so to kind of squash that rumor, Joseph Sr. actually had Alvin dug up. You can imagine how traumatizing that would have been. He had him dug up and inspected to make sure that his grave hadn't been disturbed. So that was
he had to dig him up to see that his grave wasn't disturbed.
Yeah, to make sure that he was still there and that he hadn't been moved.
I wasn't there, but I would imagine that if somebody dug up a grave, you wouldn't need to dig to see that it was dug up. Is that, or maybe?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you could. I think he dug him up to
or was
show
it
that.
a long time after?
Yeah, so it would have been at least a year.
Okay, so a year after, that makes sense.
Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, they exhumed his body, and Joseph Sr. had it published in the newspaper that said, "No, nobody dug up my son to move him,
He's
and
still there.
he's still there.
Cool.
He's undisturbed." So
Awesome.
personally, I think that rumor would have been extremely hurtful for the Smith family, and then having to relive it by digging up their son to prove a point, to get the rumors stopped. I think that would have been pretty rough.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, this might be a good pausing spot. I don't know if
Wow. Yeah, the time just flew by.
it was. Yeah. No, these questions were great. Whoever they are, we big thank you. Big thank you. I did want to say something as well. If you made it to the end here, I'm sure you're enjoying this as much as I am. Now, John, I haven't told you about this, so surprise. When John and I talked before we started this podcast, we were just high level trying to figure out what's the purpose of this? What do we want to do? What do we want from it? And I kind of made it pretty clear from my end that I didn't want this to be a podcast where we're asking for money. It had nothing to do with my motivations in doing this, and I'm personally, I don't feel comfortable asking people for money in nearly any circumstance. But I do recognize that, John. I mean, this was your years and years and years of education. John put a lot into this, and even every week he puts a lot into this. And I do think he deserves a big thank you from the listeners and from me. So here's what I'm thinking. I'm going to ask for money, just for people who want to donate. We have donations available on our website at withthestonerolling.org, and we're going to make sure that 100% every penny that comes in goes straight to John, and kind of
Aw.
to express the appreciation and for the hard work he does each week to put the outline together, to study these sources out, make sure that they're trustworthy. um, I hope it's okay with you, John, but if you try to convince me otherwise, I won't let you, because this is awesome. I'm loving this, and so at least for right now, until I change my mind in the morning. No, no. For right now, I think it makes sense. So please, everybody, I'm going to ask you go to withthestonerolling.org, click that donate button, and show your appreciation for John, what he does, this information that we're sharing. I'm going to see if there's other ways we can make it easier to donate. I'm kind of maybe brainstorming some ideas and everything. But for right now, please just that's my request is show your appreciation to John. I know I'm loving this, and it sounds like many others are as well.
Well, that's very nice of you. Thank you. I don't, I'm not doing it for money either. This has been a lot of fun for me too.
I understand that, but I still think you deserve. If I were to get a PhD and all your other degrees, um, and then I realized, oh wait, this was a humanities degree, which society, so humanities degrees earn their money, earn their compensation in different ways than I'm used to in my field. So sometimes you need to ask, and you need to throw it out there. So this is something that people enjoy, and I really hope that people are able to kind of help at least until they don't enjoy it anymore. but but yeah, I think it's fair, and it's something that it's important to me that we're able to do a little bit just to kind of say thank you, through that means. But it's up to you as a listener. If you're not comfortable, if you
Definitely.
don't have the money, I mean, I wouldn't donate money you don't have. That's not our motivation, is to get money. But if you have some money and you appreciate it and you're willing to share, I'm willing to just say thank you, John. There you go.
Yeah, this is our PBS plug. Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, obviously, no obligation to donate. That's not why we're doing it. But I appreciate Tyler setting that up, and yeah, that's great. If you do, great. If you don't,
Yeah, and regardless, tell your friends. 5 stars. Do your whatever plug John does. same old thing. So, I mean, to be honest, ratings and subscriptions do matter if people are trying to find us, or if people just come across us randomly. It does make a difference. So if you do that, it helps. But I don't know the details of that really. But
yeah, tell your friends, with a stone rolling, wherever you get your podcasts, wherever fine podcasts are sold. That's where we are. So,
all right. Well, oh, and we haven't talked about release dates. If you're listening to this, you might have already figured out, but I don't know when our release date's going to be. I was thinking, since we're doing this, we might do a little bit earlier in the weekend so people can listen on the weekend. But maybe I'll talk with John after about that. So.
Yeah, sounds good.
You may be surprised with a different release date.
Yeah, we'll do a surprise release. That might be fun.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks, John.
Thank you, Tyler.
Life's rough and roll on. I messed up on this, so I'm going to have to play it and then stop it again. There we go. Good night, everybody.
Oh, man.